Yeah.
Next year.
Yeah. Definitely
Wow.
getting.
Oh, no.
Okay.
Thank you.
I feel kind of almost sacrilegious turning this off. Okay, welcome back. Swift, you're gonna have to wait.
T-Swift waits for no one.
I know, that's very true. That's right. He's Swift because everything happens. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed your lunch.
It was so good.
Yeah, right? I know.
Oh my gosh, that
Not the
plantain
type-
chicken.
I'm telling you, that's not the type of lunch though that like keeps you going afterwards. Like,
I was thinking that.
I know.
Still
it's
are.
definitely- You know, just really quick about FYI, I mean, we hear a lot about it through Andy and me just because of the work that we do, but I mean, there is a lot of resource like that's free and available to you there. And, you know, I just really encourage you to, if you're looking for stuff, this isn't it's not a promotional comment. It really is more of just a resourcing comment where we're trying really hard to be responsive to current trends, give leaders stuff that really helps. And, you know, I think sometimes, I mean, even the best of us have those days when we just don't know what we're going to do next. Like, use FYI as a place to maybe just go for inspiration. You don't have to buy any of it, but there's a lot of stuff that's free. And, you know, we always keep in mind not just the leader, but usually the leader is serving parents, students, leaders as well. So sometimes it's just an article that's great for your volunteers or for your parents or whatever, right? Like, you don't have to reinvent it, just add your comments or whatever. So it's there for you if we try to keep that in mind. So anyway, take advantage of it as you'd like. I got some things I want to share with you. So we'll jump into our lecture. I want to talk about practical theology, critical realism, and epistemology. So, you know, really light topics for the afternoon. In some ways, thankfully, complementing some of the things that that Dwight talked about this morning. I mean, I really appreciated the approach that he brought with practical theology and what that does. You are going to be reading this quarter after you get back home and you get back settled into your spaces. Some additional books for the quarter, and a lot of these are really focusing on more practical theology. Andy Root's Christ of Praxis. We've got some other ones from some other Fuller faculty, and then other things as well. Sort of just thinking about this idea of how do we think about youth ministry, right? Now, and this shouldn't be scary for any of you, because I think one of the most pressing and exciting things that I heard yesterday was like, what is church? What is youth ministry? Like, these are deep theological questions that demand a practical theology speak to it. We're not like, how do we make programs better, right? We're not saying how do we get kids to church necessarily. There's something a little bit deeper than that, and I think that's what's really, really crucial. So let me just give you a bit of a primer and some ways to think about this. We'll drive this as far as it needs to go, have some discussion, and then cut her over. So and Kenneth, cut over, and Kenneth will be here. So I love a book of. Did I sign this one to you or not? I can't remember. I don't think I did.
Steve, did you want the screen on?
Oh, is it the screen's on?
I was like, are we supposed to be? I was like,
Talk about a blank.
I was like,
I'm telling you, I don't know what happens there. That's usually like an afternoon thing, right? Like it always.
Shut up. He got sunburned at lunch.
Joey.
Big egos. That's how I found out about it. Casey Chastain. That's it. Yeah. That's how I found out about it.
I know Taylor Swift.
would you
It's
like
Taylor
it?
Swift from Travis Kelce. That's all.
Yeah.
She's on ESPN.
Here we go. It's coming. It's coming, ladies and gentlemen.
Chiefs.
It looked like it was.
I was gonna say, was that a Tommy Boy reference? I thought it was. I really thought it was.
Oh, maybe if I plugged it in.
Ah, there it is.
Sound.
I was speaking at this church once, you know, and I usually come pretty self-contained with my slides and everything. I just don't trust it with anybody else. It's part of my control issues, which is not, I can talk to you about that later. I was in this church. And like typical churches have like big like landscape screens, or you have two of them or either side. That's just sort of standard, right?
Right.
For whatever reason, the tech people thought that in this church, because of the way the front of the church was set up, that they wanted a really narrow landscape like screen,
Whoa.
which nobody told me, which means that basically you would only see about 1/3 of my content on the
You probably
screen.
watched too many.
And like, I mean, I love tech people. I just like they're the unsung heroes. They only get blamed. Nobody looks at them when things go wrong, right? But they also like are very set in their ways. And this guy was like, I don't know what you're gonna do. You're gonna have to change all your slides. I'm like, I'm not gonna change all my slides. You're gonna have to do something. And we like had to stand off in the booth in the back, like right before I was going out, because I'm like, I don't know what to do. And you don't understand. Like I have like really good transitions with my slides. Like they're look really. That's very important to me. So I'm like, I'm not changing anything because this is like close to almost perfection, right? And he's like, my system is perfect, and I'm not changing either. And so we had to stand up. And so finally I was the guest, so I capitulated, but it was like everything was off, and it was like every slide I was like, ew. So anyway, thankful for these, I suppose, even though they weren't working at the moment, or maybe I forgot to plug this. Okay, we're back. Hey, so practical theology, critical realism, and epistemology. And I want to just take some time to sort of think about like what's in the water. We talked about what's in the air. How do we think about these sort of things? And I can't remember if I've assigned this book or not. If not, you should read it. But Nurturing Different Dreams by Catherine Turpin and Ann Walker. They talk about this idea that the dreams of young people matter. They really do. Like young people, we talked about this, we even heard this yesterday a little bit. Just this idea that, young people, we want them to dream, like that dreams are a good thing. This is the space that they're given permission to actually dream. And that's really important. But they also ask this question, like what happens when to dreams that are deferred? And, we were at our table, we were actually talking about this a little bit, like this idea that sometimes happens in youth ministry a lot is this idea that people will say, especially people in power, they will say like, that's a great idea, but we can't do it now, you have to do it later, right? So we defer the dreams of young people in a lot of ways. One, by derailing them. Number two, not listening to them. Number three, by just doing the wait, we'll just wait. Like we're just not ready now, right? And so usually people in power want to go too slow, and people that are really working through issues need the community or whatever to go faster because they're living it right now, right? So I don't know about you, but maybe you feel that way as you work with middle schoolers or high schools. High schoolers, like to wait 1 or 2 or 3 years is to basically wish their high school or middle school career away. Like it's over, right? So how do we hold this sacred dreaming of young people in a lot of our contexts that can't keep up with dreams and they're moving too slow? And dreams is not just like I want to be a fireman when I grow up. It's more like the dreams of young people are like the things that keep them going. They are the fuel of resilience. They are the potential of their becoming is in their identity, belonging, and purpose, right? So I think this becomes really, really important. And so what's interesting is oftentimes I think with too many well-intentioned youth workers say, well, we just need to give them Jesus, right? This is sort of like the answer to like, well, we care about young people. If we just show them Jesus, somehow magically everything is supposed to happen. But I think what happens when we do that is we turn Jesus into sort of this magical, mystical phrase, thing, person, bunny rabbit that somehow are supposed to somehow help young people, but doesn't actually get to the granular of, quite frankly, what we talked a little bit about this morning, right? Like there's this closeness that we have to get to those that we love and care for that to make a difference. And one of the things that I've just been thinking about oftentimes is when we think about the gospel as good news, like the gospel at a distance is no good news at all. Like when good news is shouted from a distance, whether that's physically, theologically, philosophically, positionally, when we shout good news from a distance, let's just be honest, it's just not good news. And I think too often in youth ministry, if we're not careful, we can come up with great solutions that work great when shot from distance, but they aren't really good news to young people and all. And I think this becomes really, really, really problematic. We have a challenge in youth ministry where I think we feel like we have less and less resource, where the impulse then is to try to be more efficient with what we use. But it seems as though we also live in a world where the only way that we can really serve young people is to get closer to them, which is a particularity and actually is not efficient. And it's impossible unless we are actually willing to get close enough to someone to know their stories, to hear them, and to whisper good news to them, right? And I think that that's more than just sentiment. I actually think it's a posture of the ways that we think about the work that we do. And this is where I actually think the practical theology comes in. And Dwight talked about this a little bit as well, right? Like there's something about our posture toward the other that requires good thinking and also really thinking about our behaviors. So when we think about practical theology, I didn't make this before Dwight said it this morning, but it is more, circular. And even this, I think, is a little bit of a misnomer. It's almost better to think of it like a spiral that's moving up and down, right? Like we're constantly revisiting the things that we are doing, and we are moving in a direction toward hopefully a better solution in the work that we do. And practical theology has four major moves. If you look at most practical theologians and some of the work that they do, I mean, if we were to break it down in sort of a system, we have these four things. The first one is this idea of really asking this question, well, what's going on? And this is sort of the descriptive empirical task, right? We're actually getting close enough to ask the question of what do we see? If you think about ethnography or anthropology, Clifford Geertz, who is like a founding anthropologist, just talked about this idea that the goal of a good researcher or a good leader is to make the familiar strange and the strange familiar. Okay. So when we make the familiar strange, we recognize that you and I could do the same things, but it has different meaning. And there are other times where you and I could do this different things, but actually they're more similar than we realize, right? We don't understand that until we get close enough, okay? So describing is the impulse there is understanding, right? Now, maybe you've had an example of someone in your church or community ministry, an adult, a parent comes up to you and say, kids, they're always on their phone. They don't really care about relationships because they're always just sort of on their phone. Notice what they're doing there. They're moving from an observation to an interpretation. And they're making a claim where they have superimposed their own narrative on a young person and making an interpretation for what that behavior is, which that may not be the behavior at all. Could it be? Maybe, but probably not, right? So what we do in this first sort of move is we are actually trying really hard to observe without judgment as to what is going on. We have to sort of start there. Now, that's not where we end, but we actually start there. What's next is we ask the question, well, why is it going on? And this is more of like the interpretive task. And let me go back up to the descriptive. Well, I'll come back to that in a second. There's the interpretive task where we begin to say, well, why is it going on, right? Like, is there a reason that a person's behaving in a certain way? What's the background? What's the research? What's the perspective that may be driving the way that people are behaving, thinking, responding the way that they do, right? So we can begin to bring, our thinking into behaviors to try to understand that better, which moves us on to this idea of what ought to be going on. This is what is often called the normative task. This is where we ask questions of theology oftentimes. Like, if this is what's happening and this is why it's happening, is that good news? Is that the best? How do we bring the gospel to bear on, like, what is redemption? What is resurrection? What is like new heaven, new earth? Where is this pointing, right? And so this is where oftentimes we bring the gospel almost in critical dialogue to the things that are happening in our world, because we want to speak to it and actually consider whether or not interrogate it and recognize this, the fact, well, what can we affirm? And what do we have to protest? Right. And then that leads us to this idea of like, well, how might we respond? And that's the pragmatic task. This is like, well, what do we have to do in ministry? Right. I like to think about it. We talked a lot about this in the church that I pastored in Grand Rapids. We just talked a lot about, like, for people and even for our organizations, what's the next faithful step? Okay. I think sometimes in preaching, you have people that are like, you ought to be doing this, you ought to be doing that, you ought to be, and what we do is we give these aspirational visions of what people should be, and people are like, I'm way back here. I don't know how to get to there. right? But true discipleship and true ministry is helping the people that we care for know what it looks like to just take a next faithful step. Why? Because then we ask the question again, well, what's going on, right? Why is it going on? What ought to be going on? How might we respond? And so you have the cycle of iterative discipleship and ministry that happens. Now, if I were to push this a little bit further, I think what we have to remember is when we talk about this idea of what's going on, and Andy Root will talk about this in his book, Christ or Praxis, is, this first part is this idea of encounter, right? Like what's going on is there's a human element to that, of what people do. But there's also this element of divine action, of asking the question, what's God doing? Like how is God showing up in this space? What might the Spirit be saying? How are people thinking about or interacting with what is working with regards to the Spirit in a particular situation? So we believe that what's going on is more than just the temporal, that there's actually a spiritual and the transcendent realm associated with that, okay? That moves us then to this idea of moving to what's going on, and this is where we can bring in oftentimes the social sciences, which we find them a lot in youth ministry, of just asking psychological questions, developmental questions, cultural questions, sociological questions, to help us interpret what might be going on in certain situations, and that's really, really important. I think this is really important in youth ministry, as you all know, and we'll read a lot more about this next year. Like, what does faithfulness and maturity, spiritual maturity, look like for a middle schooler compared to a high schooler, compared to a 25-year-old, compared to a 50-year-old, right? Like, they're not the same, right? So might we at times superimpose certain expectations on people that actually they're not there yet? Like, it's not because they're unfaithful, it's just that their brains aren't developed. Like, how do we think about that, right? So what we're trying to do is help people understand, well, like, what is actually going on, and how do we think about that? That really, again, this idea of what ought to be going on, this is sort of thinking about the theology, right? How does the gospel speak to what we are trying to accomplish? Just because you're doing good ministry in something doesn't necessarily mean that it's moving us toward the gospel, right? Like, there might be things that we have to, again, confront, change, become as we think about that. And then as we move toward this idea of responding, this is what ministry is all about. Like, as we think about these things, we respond. Now, I hope this talks well with what Dwight talks about. This thinking and behaving is always, as you can tell, working together. We're not just thinking about this and then doing it. Sometimes we're already in motion and this is happening, which is probably good news for all of us, because most of us are not like blank slate. I'm starting a church on Monday. I have nothing. I'm going to think about it and I'm going to implement it, right? Like, we're all sort of trying to fly a plane while we're building it. Like, something's been inherited to us, a tradition, people, a ministry. Like, we can't undo it all, but we have what we have, and we have to somehow think about how we have what we have and what we're doing, and then begin to make these changes along the way. You'll find it interesting. My colleague Scott Kermode talks about this a lot, that you'll find that there are a lot of leaders, especially in youth ministry, if they are new to ministry, they will come into ministry, and what is the first thing that they do? They cancel everything and start things completely by themselves, start over again. Why? In many ways, what they're trying to do is erase the past and somehow think that somehow they can just start over again, and there's power associated with it as well to redo things. That's not really a luxury. That never usually goes very well, right? It erases the storyline of the community. It erases the history. It erases symbol and tradition that may or may not need to be reimagined or changed, but to just erase it isn't necessarily going to help. Instead, what we have to do is we have to sort of embrace and accept what's been given to us, and then think about what it means for us to actually work out something different. And then I do think it gets to the point what Dwight said earlier, like, we have to ask ourselves the question, like, is this place going to change me, or do I have to change it? Is this the point? Are we going in the same direction? Am I called to this, or am I actually need to go somewhere else? I mean, that's another piece of it, but this is a chance for us to work within this as well. Okay, so this is the work that I think is more than just like a nice little circle that I want to put up here for you. I think this is a great way for you to think about your final paper for this year, is to actually ask these questions, right? You're going to identify a topic that's really, really important to you. Okay, you're probably going to say to yourself, this topic is important to me because here's what I see. Like, in my context, this is what's happening to boys and social media, or girls and self-image, or whatever it might be, and you're moved by something that you've noticed, and you somehow want to step closer to it in your writing. And then you're going to ask the question, well, what's going on? Like, and this is where the work that you've done through the resources that you have and the ones you're going to track down, you're going to try to actually begin to interpret a little bit more. But what am I seeing here? What might this mean? What does research actually say about this? And how do we think about this? And then to bring to bear theology on that and say, well, what ought to be going on? Like, what's the best thing for them? Like, the goal isn't just to make teenage boys or girls feel better. That's not the point. The point is to call them to Jesus, right? So what is actually happening theologically that we have to think about that actually informs our actions, that then moves us to ministry, right? And when we begin to think this way, I think we will find that sometimes what look like great solutions aren't. Sometimes creative ideas actually fall flat. And practical theology gives us a chance to let our ideas settle in that are responsive to the people that we care about. So the people stay center along Jesus, and then we work this process of understanding so that we can respond appropriately. This process, I think, also helps your volunteers. I mean, if I could just get really practical for a second. I think sometimes when we think about volunteers, we give them a task, but we don't tell them why they're doing the task, right? Go meet with middle school boys. Why? Like, okay, I'll do it. Like, did you meet with them? Yes, congratulations. And that's the end. Actually kind of going, do you realize that middle school boys have like not always a lot of adults that are like connected with them, that when you are with them, you add and contribute to a network of relationships that actually help them feel relational warmth. The relational warmth is a conduit for them embracing and thinking about faith. And when they begin to have a relationality connected with faith, it moves from the head to something that's much more embodied, that actually helps them picture what good news actually looks like for them. You see, like that's what you're doing when you meet with them. So when you say you can't meet with them, realize that you are risking like something much more powerful than like it didn't work out with your schedule, right? Like we actually give volunteers like help in understanding their role other than giving them their spare time, right? So we can use practical theology to not only do good ministry, but help other people understand what they're doing. And I quite frankly think it helps with their own formation. Right? Like our volunteers are also thinking about their own formation. Like this gives us a chance to recognize the fact that what they are doing as they encounter the other and as they think about the fact that the Spirit is working in this situation has a way of transforming and changing them as well. Okay? So there's a lot flying around here, but this gives us room and a rhythm to think about this. Another example, just to throw it out there, like how many times have you, I know you've never done it leading, but let's say you've been in another ministry where after retreat, someone goes, so how did it go? And right away, people are like, wow, you know, that transition from breakfast to devotions was a little bit rough. We probably should change that. Or people had fun playing, or the food was really good. I mean, all those things are really great, but that's not thinking like through a practical theology lens, right? That's logistics. And instead, like how did it go question is like, so what did we see? What do you think that means? How does the gospel speak to that? What ought we do about that? Like, what can, you know, and how do we think about this as we go home or what's going next? So practical theology gives us room to do that. And so I hope that through this program, you're constantly thinking about this loop and you're using it and playing with it. Because I think what it'll do is it'll continue to train your thinking to think about your behaviors and your thinking and how this works in the ways that we think about practical theology. And when we do that, I think then we actually do surround people's dreams, right? This is where ministry actually happens. This is what we're really doing, right? What is church? It's a community of believers that are trying collectively and individually to take the next faithful step, right? And I know it's more complicated than that, but I think there's something really, really powerful to think about that. So I'm not going to have you answer these questions right now, but just to think about, and I'll give you the PDF of these slides. Like when you think about practical theology and ministry, what might youth leaders leave out? Like what do we miss in this process? Right? What do we short circuit that keeps us from thinking deeply? Or maybe where do youth leaders get stuck? Like what's the thing that they avoid? Is there a different way that we can think about that? Secondly, how might practical theology help youth leaders respond rather than react to young people's dreams? Okay, I think the impulse of a lot of leaders is to react to the plight of young people. Oh my gosh, they're not doing something right, or they're hurting or whatever. I'm going to run in, I'm going to fix it. Right. And, I find that oftentimes a lot of younger leaders are just running from one crisis to the next, trying to somehow just help people. And the impulse of that is absolutely beautiful, but it's not sustainable. Right. To respond to the people that are under our care is for us to take the time to really think and process, what do they need? How do I care for them? What are their immediate needs? How do I help them? How does the gospel speak to this? What would Jesus want them to know? And taking it out further. Otherwise, what we do is we just sort of run around all the time, and that's when we burn out. We don't have that sense of what it really means to sort of live out this practice. Right? And then finally, how do youth leaders' roles need to shift to make this possible? I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our work tomorrow on practical theology and innovation. But I found, as I worked with a lot of youth leaders, that a lot of them were just like, I cannot wait to think more deeply and creatively about youth ministry when I have more time. Okay. And I look at them and I go, do you understand ministry? Like, when does that happen? Like, you know what I mean? And I think that the deeper challenge that I have for youth leaders is to live with the impulse that somewhere down the road, there's this magical moment when we have more time to do deep thinking, do practical theology, think about the quality of our work. I mean, it just will never come, right? The only way it works is for us to think about, and leaders to think about their roles and kind of saying to ourselves, where are the spaces that I need to create in my professional rhythms, in my ministry rhythms, where I'm to pray and to think and to ponder and to wrestle with these things, right? That is not extra. That is actually what you're paid to do, right? Some of you may not feel that way. Maybe that's not what's been communicated to you. I fully understand that. But I don't, everyone is different. So we can solve that problem like over coffee or something. But I do think I would want to give you permission today to not feel guilty about it. To not somehow fudge that because you think that, well, nobody, that doesn't produce anything, right? Like, if you're not thinking about these things, if you are not praying and contemplating these things, nobody is, right? And then we just got people running around trying to put out fires. And you won't make it. You just won't make it. Like, and I don't want that for any of you, right? Like, yeah, I mean, like, you should have a, like, I know this, not everybody has this luxury, but like, you should have a professional budget. You should make sure that you have a day off. Like, you should be able to have a retreat. Like, these things are like part of what it means to care for people, right? And, I think this gets rooted in this idea of practical theology, where this is a slow process. This isn't a quick fix, right? But I don't know any other way forward, and I think even Dwight, alluded to that this morning, right? Like, we can only get close to people if we're willing to get close to people, and that just takes time, right? And think about them, care for them, pray for them. It just takes time. And I think we are all been around long enough to know that feeling of when it's out of control. Like, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. That's, I guess, what I'm saying. But I think we need to give each other permission to make sure that we're giving that time for ourselves, but also for our ministry. And I think that's the way we really care for people. So we're going to play more with this practical theology, but I just wanted to kind of give you that oversight, and you're going to read a lot more about it this quarter. I promise. I'm wondering, does anybody have any questions, comments, things that they want to say? Happy to do that. Yeah, Michael.
So I guess the question comes to mind is, so churches like have a lot of moving parts,
Yeah.
and sometimes there could be like battle of, okay, does a person focus on this where they have an opportunity to, not ignoring the rest of the moving parts, but realizing like I'm not going to wait for the moving parts to come along with the process. Or from your experience, have you found that no, actually all the other moving parts need to be going in that direction to make an impact?
To make impact, that's a great question. Probably both. I mean, I think maybe we've experienced it, or some, this idea of where I think in ministry, I think there are times when we can make change within our sphere of power and influence, and that might be a piece of the bigger environment, as you mentioned. But I do think there are these points where we bump into other concentric circles of influence that that make it difficult for us to bring about change. So, and I think the part that, at least as I've talked with leaders and as I've thought about this, I think for young people it gets confusing, because we will tell them that this is the way it is, and here are the changes we're trying to make, and we're attending to them. But the messaging they're getting, not necessarily with ill intent, is almost contradictory to what you've been saying, and now they're confused. And so I think this is, when we think it through the lens of advocacy, I think this is when it becomes a problem. Because unless we're going to pull away from the mothership or the broader community and just say, well, don't pay attention, then we're going to work at things over there, we sort of are perpetuating this siloed existence that eventually runs out, right? Like eventually this young person, let's say, grows up and they have to somehow engage with the broader community. And maybe you've had this experience. Like I've had young people say to me, my experience in youth group was completely different than my experience with the rest of the church, and I don't know what to do with that. Part of me goes, that's completely beautiful that a youth leader did something that was significant to them. And part of me laments that because we haven't set them up to actually grow into the broader community, or maybe I haven't advocated well within that community to help them feel connected in any sort of way. So I think that's where we bump up with some things. And this is the journey really of Fuller Youth Institute research. I mean, a lot of our focus was just on like helping youth pastors be better youth pastors. But we realized that they kept bumping into these walls and ceilings of churches that were not nurturing environments that reinforced the values that were needed to help young people's faith formation, right? So I think there was this point where we bump into something. I teach a course called Leading Change Through Youth Ministry Context, and I'm teaching it right now. And it's a mashup of youth ministry and then also organizational change, because I'm trying to help my students understand that there's so much going on in a gathered community or an organization that we have to be aware of. Otherwise, we'll misinterpret and we'll not have the right conversations to actually advocate for young people, because our great idea gets stuck or contradicted or misaligned because of the work that we do. So I think there's always room to play, within our spaces, but then I think at some point we bump into problems. So, and I think it's really hard for young people because they're growing up, right? Like they're not going to be in our youth ministry forever. So I think that's what makes it difficult as well. Like we somehow have a responsibility as youth ministry leaders to prepare them to know how to engage in the broader faith community. That otherwise, I think youth ministry just turns into like a cool experience in high school. It's no different than like volleyball, and then I think that becomes a problem. Is that helpful?
Ask a question.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, how many people in here had a formative youth group experience?
What do you mean by formative?
Well, I guess that could depend on the individual.
Yeah.
But I guess how many would qualify their experience in a youth group as formative and who they are now?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Because I'm curious, just curious, because I would, but I wonder, I know everybody's taking different paths, but I'm curious, found their youth ministry experience formative, or if you even have one. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Sorry.
No, that's good. What was that? About 2/3?
Okay. Just wondering.
Do you wanna, where is that thinking going? Where you,
Well,
keep going?
I don't know. I mean, I either like can I think do what you can to help young people, set up young people for success in their faith, you know, by creating healthy contexts for growth, connecting them to the larger body of the church. They might not have the life experience to be able to make the connection now, but I didn't. But I can look back and say that mattered, and that was it. Like, and this is why it mattered. This is what it did for me. Just curious if who all shares that kind of experience, to be able to look back and say, you know, I needed that other adult outside of my parents to be in my life, and that mattered. So there's a lot of us. So.
Which is, I think, a great testament, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're probably grateful for people in our lives that invested in us. And
Yes.
yeah, it's good. It's good. Well, let me take this a little bit further, because I think this, you guys read Andy Root's book on the secular age, and maybe some of you have looked at Charles Taylor's work as well. But I think that this book was not the lightest of the books that I had you read, and like, I mean, if you ever try to read like Charles Taylor's book, that's like, Andy's is like, thank you, Andy. I mean, because Charles Taylor is like, whoa, man, that guy's a brainiac. I mean, it's amazing. But I think Andy's ideas of the secular age are really, really helpful, and it helps us actually think about practical theology as well. And just again, I'm just going to give you some reminders of this for a second. You remember that when Andy talks about this idea of secularism, that there's sort of these layers of secularism that have morphed and changed over time, actually quite dramatically in the last 500 years. But he talks about, first of all, this idea of secular zero, right? This is the place of sort of an enchanted age. So this idea of sacred and secular doesn't exist in secular zero. It's like everything is just sort of ripe with like spirits and power and religion and all that comes of that, right? So there isn't, you're not really like sacred or secular. You are sort of always sort of in the air and the water of angels and demons and gods and, you know, and forces and all that come with that. And so Charles Taylor and Andy talk about this idea that people are like porous, like we actually can be impacted by the angels and demons and powers and forces as well. So there's something that is scary about that. The world is very scary. It's wrought with like all these different forces that are at play. And so, you know, belief is sort of just perpetuated everywhere. You believe in something simply because that's kind of the way the world works. And so, you know, a lot of ways, like if you were like a pastor back then, in many ways, what you're doing is you're trying to help people navigate an enchanted world. Like, what do I do about spirits, or, you know, what happens when there's a full moon, or what all might happen there? There's all these things that are happening. And so, so people were deeply religious, if we could use the proper, you know, a proper maybe name for that. And the job of the pastor or the minister or the religious person was to sort of help people navigate. So sacred, secular wasn't even a question. Everything was just sort of sacred. But what happened is, through a lot of different things, I mean, everything from Enlightenment, Reformation, and things like that, a move happens where we find that with secular one, that all of a sudden there is this dichotomy between public and private. Okay, the sacred and secular are still existent, but they're a little bit more porous. And one all of a sudden has a will. They can decide, like, well, what part of like my life am I like going to engage that's sacred, and what part of my life am I going to engage that's secular, right? A lot of times this may be in the realm of like what I choose to talk about or what I don't, right? Like all of a sudden there's certain things become privatized, like religion or politics, where other things are more public, right? So you sort of have that dynamic going on. And I think the ministry impulse here in some ways is like how do I get people to address religious topics, right? Like how do I actually get them to go there to talk about the idea of religion and their spiritual lives and that sort of thing. People may or may not choose to do that, but I think the impulse, the religious impulse, is somehow to get there to talk about them with that, because religion and the sacred and the secular are still present. It's just I can choose how I'm going to engage them, which is sort of a different move from secular one, where I don't have a choice. Like it's just in the air, it's everywhere. So now I have this choice, which moves to secular two, which is where we all of a sudden realize that it's not about just people being porous, or sacred and secular being porous and kind of bump into each other, that there's actually like religious spaces and a-religious spaces or non-religious spaces, okay? There are realms that are completely secular and there are realms that are completely religious. And all of a sudden what happens is almost there becomes a competition between religious and a-religious spaces, right? Like who goes to what in youth ministry. I think this comes down to where we hear a lot of maybe the battles in our conversations of like, wow, you're choosing sports over church. Why would you choose like Jesus over the devil, or I don't know, whatever it might be. I mean, sometimes we put kids in situations where there's like this dichotomy of you can either be in a secular space or you can be in a religious space. You can choose like to follow God, or you can go and do this thing that's completely other. And so I think sometimes the ministry impulse here is like, how do we attract people or get them back to church, right? Get them back to a religious space. We don't want them over there, because if they're over there, that's probably secular. Now, if I can get them over here, somehow there's something about being in this space that's actually going to be good for them, and they're going to be in sort of this religious space again. This runs into a little bit of a problem where I think what happens is that we move to secular two, we find, and this is sort of the critique that many have of youth ministry, is that we start seeing youth ministry as like a good, just like every other sort of option that's out there for young people. So now the ways that we posture ourselves to get the attention of young people is more through marketing than any practical theology, right? Like, what do I need to do to get kids to come to our church rather than something else? How do I show them that Jesus is better than something else, right? There's this pull in many ways to almost figure out how we can win the marketing battle for the battle of their time, of young people's time, to get them to be a part of youth group. Now, it doesn't mean that coming to youth group is bad. I mean, that's fine, but just the ways that we begin to think about it begins to give a challenge. But Andy goes further and he says that that there's not just secular two, there's also secular three, where the immanent frame is actually the default. So in secular zero, the transcendent frame was the default. People couldn't think about a world other than angels and demons and spirits and everything else, and they somehow had to operate in that. Secular three is the complete opposite. People can't imagine a world other than the here and the now. Like, there is no angels and demons or spirit or God or anything out there. Everything is in the immanent frame. It is the default hardwired operating system by which people work from. And so what happens is that as ministry leaders, when we try to bring up God or talk about God, we almost feel awkward with it, because there's like, it just seems completely out of place. Like, people don't have a category for it. So we're bringing in something that is just like a fantasy, right? It would be like having a serious conversation and trying to solve it, and you bring up like Lord of the Rings. Like, there's no, like, that. It's like, it's fantasy. It's like, at best, right? So there's no place for it. Okay. And so, and this is where, experience is confronted, and belief is, what he says is fragilized, right? This idea that belief is just something that's for yourself or whatever, but it doesn't have any power associated with it. Now, the problem in youth ministry, at least some of the critique that you're going to read about, and we've already have a little bit, is this idea that sometimes we live in secular 3, but youth ministry is still acting like we're in secular 2. Okay. So we have young people that have an imminent frame default wiring, but we keep trying to convince them that church is a good place because Jesus matters or that type of thing. And that's what, in many ways, is the problem. And the disconnect is young people don't necessarily understand that, or we keep trying to get young people to market to them to somehow come back to church. And what we're not doing is we're not actually thinking about what's actually happening in secular 3. Now, what one of researcher at USC, Richard Flory and his colleague Lindquist Denton, they wrote, if you remember, like some of you brought up moralistic theotherapeutic deism and Christian Smith's work, the last 4th wave was actually reviewed by Flory and Denton, and they were continuing to look at sort of the longitudinal study of these teenagers that are now in their mid to late 20s, right? And Richard came up with the title for the book called Back Pocket God. Just this idea that that God is basically not transcendent. I'm not a count. He would say that these young people now would not say that there's a God that they're accountable to. That God is like a like an app, like it's in the back pocket. Like this is the book, like it's in the back pocket, and we pull out God to perhaps maybe help us with something, but it's actually like we are the authority figure and God is basically just a supporting app. We aren't necessarily responsible to God. And so there's sort of the switch. And so this is what they're seeing in their research, okay? Now, just go back to the slide, I didn't finish here. So like when we think about the ministry impulse, it's like, how do I talk to people about God when their default is absent of the transcendent, you know? And Charles Taylor talks about this idea that the way we talk to people in secular 3 is the fact that people have this haunting. He would say that secular 3 people are, and he uses secular 3, but you know this realm, people in the imminent frame are sort of nervously looking over their shoulder. That there's this longing for something more. That though the imminent frame is the default, there seems to be something that they're searching for or they're experiencing that they don't have language to understand or comprehend or know what to do with this. A lot of times this comes out in fear or loneliness, all different types of emotions along the way. And so how does the gospel begin to speak to whatever is sort of haunting them, that's chasing them as they're looking over the shoulder, and how can we give language to that and help them perhaps understand what is going on, right? We can't appeal to an operating system that assumes that God's in the picture, but we can appeal to the experiences that they're having and try to help them make sense of what's happening there and begin to show them that there is a God that speaks to that there is a God that shows up to that, and it's not unreasonable for that to be an option in the ways that they think about it. But it's not going to come from us like trying to appease the gods. It's going to come for them understanding a God that is aware of the fact that they're thinking and feeling certain things that they don't have language or experience for, right? I'm not going to talk much about it this week, but eventually I'll talk more about it. And I was sharing a little bit with some of you last night. That's why I think what's driving some of the work that I'm doing right now with emerging adults, where the $1 million question in so many churches are like, where did emerging adults go, right? Like that's a secular 2 question, right? Like you notice what's happening there? Okay. My answer and the work that we're doing is I think they're showing up in the places of transition where they don't know what to do, which is a secular 3 view that I'm trying to take in mind. Where do they need people the most? In the places of transition where the tools that got them there won't get them to the next spaces. The place where they feel the most liminal space, the most vulnerability, and the most in motion. That they're looking for help that they can't seem to solve with whatever tools or perspective that they have right now. So perhaps it's the spaces of transition that we can actually have real conversations and speak to them about what's important to them and begin to show them that there's something about the gospel that actually resonates with their experiences, right? So I'm trying to wrestle with this from actually almost a social science perspective, to not try to think about strategies to get them back to church as much as to say, where are young people? They're in the spaces of transitions, and how do the people of God show up there, right? And what's good news to them there, right? And so that's driving a lot of the work that we're trying to understand. And the only way we understand that is through the research, is to actually listen to emerging adults. I love what Dwight said earlier. Like when we put together even our research, like we have an emerging adult advisory council that's actually giving us input before we send surveys out or whatever, because we don't want to in any way misjudge or make assumptions about the questions that we're asking to emerging adults, because we want to hear their voices. We want integrity in our research to do that. So there's more coming with that. But I think this is the work that we're trying to figure out. And so I think the challenge for youth ministry is to ensure that in a secular free world, we're not doing secular 2 strategies or asking secular 2 questions. And this is where it gets really, really hard, because I think most of your job descriptions, if you're in youth ministry, probably cater more to a secular 2 sort of job description, right? Like, how are people showing up, right? So I think some of the tension that we feel is not just that, like, churches don't get young people. Like actually we're misjudging like secularism, like, you know, like the underlying assumptions between generations is such that that we're almost not addressing the right questions, and that demand different sort of solutions, right? And the way that we define the problem is the way that we'll try to solve it. So again, this is where practical theology becomes really, really important. Like, if we don't take the time to think about these things, we will make assumptions about where everybody's at, and we'll offer solutions that nobody cares about. And I think this is the problem. It's not that Jesus is not a good answer. It's just that for secular 3 years, that it doesn't compute. Like, there's no place for that to go. There's not a category for that. And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? We can think about youth ministry, and we'll learn more about this in future years. But like, I mean, we just have, especially in the States, generations of people that are becoming less and less religious. So to be able to pass the faith on to the next generation is becoming more difficult. So oftentimes, if you notice, like, some churches are like, parents, you're the primary disciples of your kids. I'm like, well, they haven't been discipled. So we place an expectation on them that they don't know how to fulfill. So we just perpetuate a problem rather than actually taking the time to go, well, what? Like, are they discipling? Yeah, they're discipling in something, but not Jesus, because they've never been discipled, right? So this is the problem. And if we're not aware of that, I think it creates a problem. So this secular 3, I think, space opens up some really, really interesting challenges. Andy talks about this idea that there's this fragile belief that comes with secular 3, that on the positive side, there's this deep longing for meaning. Right? This is where we can say the gospel brings meaning. But the challenging side of it is there's this loss of transcendence. And so there aren't categories for that. So I think it forces us in many ways to maybe step further back and sort of think about how we address these longings. But perhaps the first move isn't necessarily in the realm of transcendence. It's talking about that, but in a way that they can understand. Okay. Anybody want to make any comments on this? Again, you've been reading some of this. This isn't completely new to you, but I think it's important for us to understand. Yeah.
I love what you said about often we say Jesus is the answer, but what's the question?
Yeah.
Often people aren't asked the question.
Yeah.
And I guess it goes to churches and leadership in churches about, what does good look like? What does success look like?
Yeah.
What are we measuring?
Yeah.
Because all of those things drive behavior.
Yeah.
And if filling up youth group on Friday nights, bums on seats, that's the goal, then obviously we're not if we're living in a secular free world, then what tends to happen is the youth groups that run the best program tends to draw this merry-go-round of youth going from program to program.
Yeah.
And that seems to be the way most churches are still operating.
I think so. We feel good about ourselves. And I think we have to ask ourselves the question. I mean, this is a critique even of FYI, to be really honest with you all, is that I think our work can be misunderstood. That if you do the things that FYI says, your youth groups will be bigger and your churches will survive. Okay, that's not the gospel. Like that's not the point of youth ministry, right? But I can understand how it can be misused that way. And so, we have to sort of interrogate our own work to make sure. I mean, I can't control somebody who uses our material. Like that just doesn't happen. But I think we have to ask hard questions about like what are we pointing people to, and be careful that it doesn't turn into that, because you're right. I mean, I think we can measure the wrong things and feel good about ourselves.
And I think just to finish on
Yeah.
I think for senior leaders, it's hard to be okay to go, we're investing out there and not seeing them in here. Where if you begin to think in secular three, being able to invest in programs and helping people and building trust, and not necessarily seeing the conversions and the baptisms this year. Senior pastors okay with that, and I think that's a very difficult conversation. And many of them can't wrap their mind around. So we're just throwing resources out there. Investing. Randomly.
So there's almost there's an expectation that there's a return on investment, right? It almost becomes an economic thing rather than a theological thing, right? I mean, like the theological thing is like the sower and the seeds just whips them everywhere. Like we don't know what's going to happen. Like, you know what I mean? But that doesn't work. I mean, like I know there's a budget. I know we have limitations, but at the same time, it's like if it's our own, I mean, in one of my churches, they like priced out like how many kids are in your youth group and like what's the cost per kid of being in the youth group. I get what they were doing, but I'm like, I refuse to let you dehumanize my kids that way. Like there's just no way. But I was just like, what? Now this accountant was thinking through numbers. I totally get it, but I was like, oh no. But Amber, sorry, you were gonna say something.
Oh no, I had a question.
Yeah.
I wanted to just finish that. Just when you were talking about the primary disciple maker, like the parents' primary disciple maker. I'm just wondering from your vantage point or research, like how have you seen this as a trend? Is it a trend? Is it a denominational thing? Like, I'm curious. I think I'm just trying to zoom out. Like in my church experience growing up, I didn't hear that a lot, but I was also a kid. And then like, I went to seminary, I didn't really hear it. And the church that I'm in, I hear it. And so I'm just wondering, and I think it's amazing and beautiful, but I'm literally asking like, but what about the parents that aren't equipped? What if there's not the parent in the home? The parent's not here. So I was just curious, because it's something that we all are like, oh yeah, totally. Like, is there, do you know the history there? Is it something that just is a phenomenon of American?
I don't know the history, quite frankly, but I do think it's a phenomenon of probably a little bit of, well, there's always a pendulum, right? So I think at some point parents were the primary disciples of their kids because there wasn't youth ministry. Like nobody else did it. Like you just, you kind of had a family community and you went to church together and you kind of embodied gospel and it happened, right? I think as we moved into a society that became much more atomized, we have situations where all of a sudden like youth ministry came into the realm, and I think youth ministry, the good intent was to kind of shore up maybe some of the things that parents couldn't do, right? Like, and to be that place for young people and culture, and a lot of reasons for that. I think what happened though is that I think as we continue to move in that direction, youth ministry realized that they were siloing things. So then intergenerational ministry came along and we're like, wait a minute, parents are really important. So we're kind of looping back. And one of the ways we do this is like parents, hey, don't forget your role in this whole thing, which is beautiful. And I mean, when we think about education, scaffolding, right? High expectation, high support, right? So we can be aspirational about what we want parents or leaders to do, but we have to give them the tools to actually be successful with that. Otherwise, it's just oppressive, right? And I think this is where the breakdown is. I think the assumption oftentimes is parents know what they're doing. And the reality is we're learning more and more they don't. And I don't say that disparagingly. I think it's just a confession, you know, and so the impulse, I think, for us as leaders is to be more compassionate. Maybe as a parent, I've become more compassionate. I'll be really honest with you. I think I've become more compassionate toward parents. Like, it's just really hard. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. Like, you know, I mean, you know, Kara Paula and I wrote the book on parenting, and I just tell everybody it was more of a confessional than anything else. I mean, that's all it is, right? But, you know, so I think I have a soft spot for the fact that parenting's hard. And I think sometimes that assumption of the disciple making is we just kind of think of like an intact family. We don't think about blended families, single parents, step parents, no parents, like parenting figures, grandparents. I mean, it's just really complicated. And so I think we have to have a sensitivity to the family system. Think about what we say when we say that.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah.
I think the pendulum swing is
Yeah.
helpful. And then just, I think thinking about the language, like the language we use,
Yeah.
like we all have assumptions on that.
Yeah,
There's also a shared language, like we're all like, oh yeah.
Yeah, isn't that funny? That's really
But then
interesting.
who family is, like what's different in your context or how that
Yeah.
comes into play. And then just the role of the family in
Yeah.
the culture. So that's.
I think what else is tricky, I mean, this is another topic really, but like, I mean, just parish ministry, I think that's really hard, especially in the States, right? Like this idea that we're all in a community together and we're kind of going to the same church, we kind of bump into each other beyond church. And so there's a collective narrative that we share together that reinforces values and everything else. Where now we're just much more of a in motion society that doesn't necessarily have that anymore. So that even puts more pressure on the parents. Like to say to a parent, you're the primary disciple of their kid back in the 50s, let's just say, like, I think that has a different weight than saying it now. Like now it's like, I have to be an expert in spirituality on top of 12 other things, right?
Driving them
So-
around
Yeah,
and-
that's what I'm like encountering, it's like parents are coming to us as kind of what they were sharing earlier about, you're the expert because you have like this amount
Yeah.
of experience, like they want you to be the expert, which is great, but then we're also telling them, but you're the primary discipleship.
Yeah.
Disciple makers, I'm just wrestling.
Yeah,
But I like the scaffolding, that's helpful, the high expectation. I support.
yeah, thanks for that.
What this makes me wonder about is connecting to yesterday's conversation of like, okay, so the church over the years has just been outsourcing a lot of things that used to be
Yeah.
done in a house. Connecting that to like, has family been outsourced in so many ways as well? And so we're both looking to this grand story of the Bible, which seems to be so localized in faith and family, and asking what can you offer us as a church and us as a family when everything's been outsourced? Like, where's the connection now?
Wow.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Say more about that. Like,
I just mean like school does the education, we expect church
right.
to do the faith, even like how many social, like I feel like I'm not a parent, but I have friends that are parents that are like, they have to do all these things for their kids' development, right? They have to be with all these other kids for their socialization.
Yeah.
And like, you have to go places for the goods your kid needs.
Yeah.
It's not like a home thing anymore.
right.
It's out there, and the church, it's like,
yeah,
oh,
I
you
get
need
it.
a place to stay, you need food, you need counseling, it's out there.
Uh-huh.
And so now we're like, okay, well, what is the church then? What is the church's place? What is the family place? And then I think, like what we've been talking about, the pendulum swinging, sometimes the answer is the pendulum swings the other way. And I see a rise in homeschooling. I see a rise in like kids, not even parents not wanting to send their kid to youth group because they don't want you to have any control over their religion, right? So they've swung
Yeah.
back saying like, I don't like the outsourcing.
Uh-huh.
Everything's coming all the way back. Nobody's having. So then we get this bifurcation, right, of
Right.
like the homeschool crunchy families recycling. And like, then like everyone who's just buying into the way the world is now
Yeah.
and we're somewhere in the middle. I don't know.
It's really interesting.
No, that's real. That's
Yeah.
real.
Probably not.
Yeah. Well,
It's like
I've never heard that.
It's like a granola mom, like
Oh, it's like a
everything's
granola,
organic.
okay.
It's kind of like
Yeah.
returning to the
It's-
subject, yeah.
it's funny.
I
got you.
oh yeah. Yeah, it's a good, that's good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it's a good.
Yeah.
No dyes, no additives.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, I think this, I think if we were to tell the story of youth ministry, I think we have to recognize the fact that its current form came out of a particular cultural milieu, right? a parachurch organization, a time when teenager was kind of a new concept, right? I mean, and it's like, it's like, what is the essence of youth ministry and how can we keep that without holding on to all the constructs that actually perhaps are outdated, right? Like, so I think it does get back to some of these deeper probing questions of like, what is it like? So the question of like, how do we get young people back to church? Like, well, back to what? Like, what is the church holding, embodying, teaching, communicating? Like, if we can't answer that, then we're just thinking that somehow showing up at a building is like magical. Like it almost like moves back to one of the earlier secularists in some ways, right? Like, now there's nothing wrong with being in church and being with the community. I don't want to dismiss the value of that, but I also think we just can't assume that just by them showing up at youth group, like church, like everything's solved, right? They're coming with longings, like some real needs, and I think we have to ask ourselves, well, what are those?
I was gonna say, so that kind of, I think just brought up the whole pandemic piece where you could not go in the building anymore.
Right.
And just well, I know we didn't, the Black church didn't go in the back in the building. I know some did not either, but we definitely didn't go back for a long time.
Yeah.
And that's what we had to do to show that the church is not just the building, and so that brought in that whole conversation as well. But I wanted to ask the question, we'll kind of go back to when you were saying, this religion versus a religion puts kids in a dichotomy. And I even and it confuses them, because it's like, so we just Orange just did a roundtable on balancing church engagement versus extracurricular activities. And we were just talking to people about how to balance that, how to not create a competition, it not being a competition where a lot of times as youth leaders, we see it. Oh my God, they got soccer on youth day, the day that we're doing, or a game or something, and not looking at it as a competition. But we were talking about how us showing up to those places kind of represents the church, but also represents the Spirit and God, who we represent, showing that, hey, God is here too. God is not just at youth group, but we will show up to show that, God will show up here too, and that you don't have to come to the church building. You don't have to. And so I just think about how that confuses kids. And, when we create the competition between volleyball and church or band and church, how by us creating a competition, we confuse them about faith, and faith being in the building or outside or whatever, and who God is. And so that bothers me. It breaks my heart, because that's where they start separating church and culture. They start separating it, and don't make it like a life style, so.
It feels like we force them to choose. We give them a false choice. It doesn't mean that they can do everything. Like, they have to choose to do some things and not do other things. There's no doubt about that, because we can't do everything, right? But to force them to make a choice where maybe there's a third way, which seems more gospel-y to me, seems like a way to honor them rather than, like you said, just confuse them or quite frankly hurt them, right? Yeah. So I think it's a great point.
That's sometime in adulthood we want to integrate work back into faith for them. We're like, oh, and then this is how your daily life. It's like we're separating it in youth, and then we're trying to reattach it.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I like what you said. What are we inviting them back to?
Yeah.
I think not many churches ask that question enough. From senior pastor on down, I think the church's image of church. Taylor's question actually pertains to this. How many of you grew up in a youth group that formed you? And we have a recollection of it. The question is, are the youth now in need of exactly what we went through? Is that the program we're trying to recreate for them? Are they in a place where that kind of program would help them? And in older churches, it's always the popular phrase is, that's the way we've always done it. But we don't ask, what are we really, what's the why, as Simon Sinek would say, what's the why
Yeah.
you exist? And what's the why of the youth group?
Yeah.
I wonder if that question being answered will help to define what's the what and then the how. But so this conversation is stirring that thought, and I appreciated your challenge of what are we inviting them to?
Right.
To have friends. They're like, no, I got enough friends in my club.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Is it to sense of belonging? Yes and no. You know, I have 2,000 followers. I have belonging, but is it real?
Right.
So is it authentic belonging?
Right. Yeah, and I think the argument sometimes to make us church people feel better, like, well, that's not spiritual, or well, that doesn't really count. What we have is like real friends or real community.
Yeah.
And there could be some truth to that, but not for someone that lives with an operating system of the immanent frame.
Right.
Like it does, that's not even a conversation anymore. So we get ourselves in a situation where we're giving responses or excuses for something that is missing the real longings that they have. Like, I think that's the question we have to come back to is, again, what are their behaviors doing and what's the meaning behind it? What are they longing for, right? And how does the gospel speak to that, right? Yeah.
One of the phrases that Cormode used in his book that stunned me was talking about how the church is calibrated for a world that no longer exists. You know, I mean, that just like burned into my head, and it made me think just in this conversation, like how are we applying the gospel to those needs of young people? Like we need to start with their needs and then work into putting the gospel into that. I mean, and that seems counterintuitive because we've always said, well, the gospel is unchanging, and that's true. It is unchanging, but the needs of our young people are changing, and who they are is changing. And so we almost have to work backwards. Not like here's the gospel and it's going to work for you, and we're going to force the gospel peg into your life, your life whole, as opposed to the other way around.
Right. And secular too would be like, well, we might do that, like, well, you can choose God or not, but I mean, if it's in the immanent frame, you have to start with these longings because there's no other place to start. You see that?
And losses too, it's like
longings, losses.
Again, like start with that, and then
Just to add to that, that's a powerful statement with what you just said earlier. And I've just been observing my own son in just the area of friendship and where he goes. I've got my church friends, I've got my speed queuing friends, I've got my other friends. And when he had a birthday, he's like, I'll have my speed queuing. Like, well, his school friends.
That's right.
Maybe I'll have another party. And and then he's got all his online friends that he's never met in person, but they're real friends because they on Discord every day for hours just hanging out. And so it's I think it gets even down to that basic level of what is friendship for our young people.
Wow.
Because like my friend used to work at Microsoft, leading the work around the metaverse. And he starts telling me these crazy things, and I'm like, stop, it's too crazy. And he's like, it's not that far off. It's coming at us, and so I'm kind of thinking, like, how do we get to the level of our young people going, what is friendship to you, and helping them navigate that? Because youth groups are like, hey, let's reach out to our friends and bring them to youth group on Friday nights, and I'm driving an hour from home. I'm like the youth bus picking up all these kids from our area and bringing them all the way to the city where the building is. And out of 15 youth, like 7 of them come in or 6 of them come in my car. And so, it's all of these questions about we're structured for a world that no longer exists. And they define friendship very differently than how we as adults think. And so I don't pretend to even understand that just yet. So, but that longing for friendship is still there.
Absolutely.
That core human feeling.
That's what I'm hopeful for with the ways you write and you think about your projects. Like, I think if we can get to this level of thinking about, where are young people looking over their shoulders? What are they longing for? How do we understand that? How does the gospel speak to that? I think we can do a great service to the church to give them perhaps new perspective and language. Because I think that and then I'll take a break. I think that most church people have good intention. Like, I think, I think we are offering critical critique, not because we hate the church, but because we love the church and we're a part of it, right? Like, it's a critique of ourselves, right? But I think we also know that the people in it, I mean, generally speaking, like, care about people. They care about young people, right? But they don't necessarily know how. And so I think we have a big challenge ahead of us to think about how we can recalibrate for a generation.
Root uses the language, this was a reading paper, this idea of subtraction, like operating out of a sense of like what you've lost, and so I think that's the biggest challenge, especially in my context, is like, how do you get a church to not operate out of a feeling of what they are losing? It's every time they ask the question, well, where are the young people? How do we get them back? How do we, the analogy is plugging the drain of what we see spinning away from us. And so how do you get out of that sort of reactionary, we think it's proactive, but it's really just reacting,
Right.
And so how do we operate out of a sense of positivity or hope or what we can offer, as opposed to how do we just prevent this from happening?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that's tough for, I know, my context.
I think a lot of context.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's a product of church communities themselves losing their sense of the transcendent, right? The willingness to kind of just trust the Holy Spirit. And like some of what you were saying, Leon, too, in terms of wanting that return on investment, and then the reactionary response, and we got to plug the drain. What are we losing? Instead of just even entertaining the notion that community for youth is very different. They're seeking the same thing at a very basic level, but friendship and community for them, totally on Discord, those are real relationships, even though they have never met these people in person. So how do we as ministry leaders and churches respond to that? And are we willing to lean into that? Kind of what we were talking about before, we can't go back. How do we move forward? And I don't know, just kind of, have we lost our sense of the transcendent as church communities too?
Or do we pitch ourselves as like God is transcendent and people are people, and they're not seeing where heaven touches earth?
Right.
Because like we've read so much about like how church or gospel can't be a good, like it can't be a product, which I fully believe, and I understand the readings, but also how many times in the arc of the Bible is God really meets people as a product, food, shelter, healing. Like there's a very physical experience of God showing up for people. And so I guess I'm kind of wrestling with, okay, we want God to be something other than product, yet so many times he meets God through something physical. So now it's just transcendent. And so how can people reconcile that?
We'll take a break, but I think it's both and. I mean, I do think when we think about practical theology and we think about what's going on, I think that Root would argue that there's the human action, but then there's also divine action, right? And so we give language to those moments where heaven and earth touch. And we open up the possibility with people and young people to recognize the fact that there's more than just like the physical healing that's happening here, that perhaps a healing God is trying to get their attention, right? So I think what we have to do is provide window, lenses, language for them to actually consider that in a world where their hardwired system doesn't consider that, right? So it's there, but in their minds, it's not. And so I think that's the calling in our hearts. And I think the change for us is our assumptions, right? We can't assume that a young person necessarily thinks about transcendence, though it is fully there as we believe in the gospel. So I think there's ways to make that connection. Let's take a break, shall we? It's 3 o'clock. Why don't we just take a good 15 minutes, go outside, walk around a little bit. I'm gonna share one more thing, and then Cutter and Kenneth are at 4. So
Man.
That's good.
I think they're being recorded. I don't know. I thought Eric was recording that. Yeah, so I hope so. We're gonna find
I think
out.
it's right downstairs. Yeah. Anybody want to go on a walkie check? I'm gonna run to the bathroom. Bianca, do you mind if I use your charger for just a couple minutes? I was taking notes on my iPad and then it just crashed.
For your phone, you need your, I have a Mac too.
Oh, I got this one. It was this.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Oh, I like that. I thought it was a book.
Oh, yeah, it's cute.
So cool.
And it's got the little pin holder in it.
Yeah.
Just was very powerful. So yeah.
I want to read that.
I mean, that was my favorite book on my.
These things like,
Yeah.
it has like.
This got my brain working
Connect
over.
it with your
What is it?
computer.
I can't believe it.
I want to see if I can fill it up.
You know what's wild? This is what we see, like, it's my volunteer.
Whoa.
It's gonna skip out of this, okay?
So what is what's the guy?
Let's go to this.
What's the biggest critic? What does he think? He's gonna take it?
This one. Show already.
Like, yeah.
Show already. Let's go. Okay. Let me go back. Go back again. Then. I think it's just a resolution setting is misreading.
Yeah, so.
It went over here. Sorry. Hello.
Someone's.
That's extended.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. So, like,
Is this?
the
Color
I mean, I
profile.
know what's up.
Can you see?
One of my contacts for the Wyoming senator, and she was here and she because they like just have.
You know,
This should do it, but I think it's a TV setting.
I just wonder, it's like, you get a vibe.
I'm the mirror.
That's a conversation that we're
Trying to.
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
the older millennials who were, that's where Facebook started. You know, the late 2000s.
Yes.
And now it's-
I'm gonna try unplugging it and plug. Oh no.
Yeah, maybe.
And then. Oh, I think this way. It's not HDMI. That's why. They're using SGA. This is the older technology.
I can use it.
Oh, you can? Do you have an HDMI cable?
Okay.
There's one right here, yeah.
But this is your dongle. I think
No,
this
this
is.
is the TV's dongle.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
Should we give that a try?
If there is an HDMI, that should work.
We're not that far removed from the beginning of social media. We were all there. So now, like now we're actually. Yeah.
Oh.
How the wind blows, it doesn't matter to me. Ain't a big deal.
But we let our 7-year-old cruise around town by themselves.
Yeah, it's still,
Yeah.
the cable coming from the TV is still this.
What do you use to take notes on?
That's why.
Notability. Yeah.
Yeah.
I used to use just a note app, but Notability is pretty cool.
That looks cool. Are you an artist? I can't.
Yeah, kind of. I used to be an architect
Okay.
Yeah.
You're an architect.
for 10 years. Yeah,
Not know that.
yeah,
Amazing.
yeah. Yeah, a long time ago.
Cool. Very cool. Yeah, but then what brought you out of that industry?
I mean, at the time I was doing youth ministry. I found it really fulfilling compared to sitting with people during the week and dealing with clients who just kind of wanted to make money fast and like, what am I doing here, right? And I was going out with my wife at the time. She was with InterVarsity at the Harvard campus. So I got a taste of what, kind of what full-time ministry looked like, right? And as we were dating and as we were kind of moving closer to
Yeah, I was
married,
curious a while back, but.
kind of talked about it, what would it look like for us to be in ministry, you know, that. Yeah, I talked to my pastor at the time about it. He was really encouraging.
Oh, really? I think it was like.
Pay attention for it.
I'll tell you.
Serious thing about it. Yeah, pastor being a pastor, but, yeah, so that's kind of it. I was like, all right, that's it. Yeah, I moved out of that.
What kind of architecture work was it?
It was just like a lot of commercial residential. So in New York, you have a lot of these buildings where you've got the commercial on the first floor, and the upper floors are like just the condos, like units and stuff. So we did a lot of that. You know, and after a while, it's just it's the same thing over and over again. All the things you see in the media about how great being an architect is, that's true for maybe 1% of.
Like on How I Met Your Mother.
Oh, no, I was not Ted. I built cool buildings. I was not Ted. It was not.
I really was.
They said. Yeah.
So that's questions, right?
Yeah, haven't looked back. I don't. There's almost nothing I miss.
Yeah.
It's just so stable.
And also,
No.
It's good. It's good to be like,
Hey. But you went up to them.
Yeah.
We have a group of boys at church.
Are you
During lockdown?
Yeah, I'm using good notes.
The running group. You know, everyone got into
Yeah.
I do like it. I just was wondering if there's stuff out there with better templates for like
and then go grab
note taking, better just different options for
that's what they're doing.
organized.
And then he said to me
I
the other day, he found a lot of
different features.
that don't go to church.
I mean, I guess it really depends on just
Go to
like
the
the
mail
preferences.
Yeah.
I only
And connect it.
just found
It's
like templates for notability. Like they'll have
They
like
eventually
and
do
stuff.
that. Gonna run together.
And the way that they organize stuff is okay. But I mean,
So I thought
it's-
so just, yeah.
So good.
I've
Yeah, just
used OneNote before, you know, and the cool thing about OneNote is that you can sync across like if you have Microsoft
Yeah.
platforms, right?
Okay.
The only thing with OneNote is that on the tablet, for whatever reason, we just haven't gotten the writing ability right.
Yeah, I think that's
You
like.
can write on a OneNote tab, like on the page, but then it's just kind of weird the way it's not like here where I tip on the.
I would love to.
The writing, right? Yeah. It's just, I don't know. I don't know why computer people can't get things like
Yeah.
straight.
And got them to do some sort of project.
Is that right?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
That they're.
That's so great. Yeah, I mean.
I think more than anything, I just need a small iPad. And just,
Oh yeah,
They're
a little bigger.
Yeah, so that's.
have like a little bit
Yeah, and I think also.
like an iPad
having parents
Pro.
Bro, yeah.
Like,
It's there, like.
sounds very boring. It's
I'd like to kind of move away from using my laptop really, but if there was a strong tablet to like do all the processing I do.
In our church.
The iPad Pro is good for most everything we do. The only thing that I feel like it's not great for is when I'm using MailChimp. So I use MailChimp to send out emails to like the family stuff. For whatever reason, they just can't get it right. Like, I tried to do Chrome on iPad. Yeah, I just can't.
I used to use MailChimp and then like based on my email server, it started sending to everybody's trash and I could not fix it.
Oh, yeah. I've done that before, but not, sorry. Yeah.
It was just, and then it had something that has to do with my like server. I don't know if that had to do with like our servers. What the deal was.
Yeah.
Just Gmail or I don't know.
I mean, if you
I do miss MailChimp.
Oh, so you haven't used it for a while. The worst part of it, I mean, I still use it only because I haven't taken the time to find something better. The worst part of it is that it used to be that the free version also had the set to send later option, and now it's not. Now it's like, yeah. So I created a new account for this church, sorry, last year.
Yeah.
And then I created everything, I was gonna set it later, and I'm like, where's the option? And I try, and it's like, oh, you have this
Been
option.
like grandfathered in?
No.
Okay, but they had just.
Yeah, they just, yeah. It's like, oh, now that is a part of the premium.
Then there's things.
Yeah, come on. So what do you have?
So we have like software so we figured out over there.
Yeah.
And how did your webinar go?
It's nice, it's easy, it's
Yeah.
for our side.
We had a great lunch. We had some really good
That's
conversations.
similar to
Because
mine, kind of like,
Oh.
like
Yeah,
good
it's a
characters.
lot.
but,
yeah, Chuck did a good job. Good.
So I got a group
Gang
set
was
up.
there, FYI gang.
I don't love
Yeah.
again,
That was good.
mobile version of something like that doesn't work.
Glad that worked
perfectly.
out.
And I'm like.
Like,
Yeah.
for some reason,
Yeah, yeah,
using
yeah.
mobile version of Bucknote, you can't copy and paste.
It's like a
Because like,
yeah,
you can,
yeah, yeah.
but like,
I'm a manager.
it's
Right.
glitchy, like
Yeah,
it'll, you know how you like to hold down on the iPhone and
right.
Yeah.
that'll pop up? Well, it flashes, it blinks.
Oh,
So you can't click on copy or paste.
So
It's weird.
I'm like trying to like.
But-
is that like you have to pay a subscription to it?
So, yeah, so we're using it across our, like, all
Yeah,
the
yeah.
ministries are using it.
Yeah.
It's the, you know, there's like community trend builder, which I think stuff like that gets a little more expensive.
Yeah.
Kind of other things.
Okay. I've been slowly trying to inception the idea of church center.
Church center,
Yeah, for us, because right now, like, I just have nothing, right? And I'm like, look, you use church center, I never have to handle a retreat payment ever again. Everything is
Okay, that's
on
good to
there.
know.
Yeah,
Because we just started using Church Center for like a mobile directory.
okay.
So if there's more features, I might need to look into that.
So, I love the retreat fee, like collection option for it. The only thing is they do charge like, it's like, you know, cents for every transaction, whatever it is. The thing I really loved about it was when a family was like, oh, something came up, I can't make it. So I'm like laying there in bed on my phone and I do the return to their credit card, like from my phone, yeah.
That's really nice.
Yeah.
Have that option. I feel like.
Yeah. And I never, and then while we were using it, I never touched cash or check ever again. So like for this church, I'm like, we gotta get on that because I do not want to handle money. I shouldn't have to, right? And the leadership have to, it just gets messy.
It does. It does, for sure. And then there's the people, like whose ministry is actually getting, like, are you marking it for the right ministry?
Yeah, all that.
You're gonna try and planning center online.
Oh, planning center, yeah.
All kinds of,
Church
yeah.
center, all sorts of.
Yeah.
you know,
Whichever
whatever.
software. We have, we use like Church Center for our mobile directory and.
Do you know what?
So what do you, y'all?
When I was in youth. Oh, really? Church community mother.
Okay.
And it's like, they buy into it. before
Yeah.
you-
So-
Planning Center for like our ministry, like our worship team, use Planning Center. I don't know why we're, now that I'm talking about it out loud, I don't know why we're using all these different
And
platforms.
often it's like, there's no conference with,
For everything.
you know, it does get pretty pricey.
Got your haircut?
Yeah.
That's helpful.
So,
Yeah, for us it was, yeah. Cool.
so having both, so planning center was more expensive in terms of the, what we own.
Yeah.
Was that, like, what are the differences in terms of the features? I guess, having used.
About the same. We
the website?
provide better software.
Okay.
Customer service. Yeah, like
Okay.
it's just a better software.
Yeah, okay.
Because I mean, the services
Yeah,
alone
obviously
is like
it's
goodness.
like-
That we were using
Yeah,
services.
right.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't-
For,
Yeah.
yeah,
stuff.
so
They use Salesforce as like the main CRM.
oh, for PCO.
But
Yeah, no, I feel like it's hard
Thanks,
to like,
people.
yeah, you gotta
Yeah.
like do some work to find that
There's,
person.
like, groups for attendance tracking. Second is more catered towards like a traditional church like
My hair.
format.
Ooh.
But if you use it for like a offsite, I think it's needed to. But right now we're mainly using services and some groups.
Broken.
Every time I bring up PCO, like, everyone just kind of balls when they look at the price, I'm like,
I didn't
guys, it's
realize
worth it, man,
some of
like,
them
everything can
individually
go into this one place.
Yeah.
Like, if we talk, yeah, we talk
Weird.
retreat fees,
And then,
directory, getting
Yeah, and
or
then-
just keeping track of like, hey, did you call this person? Did someone check in on this person? Like, it's all on there, right? Like,
yeah.
people,
I used to live with.
so it's kind of a process of getting them to slowly see, hey, we should invest in this.
Mm.
It was a beautiful community.
That stuff is taken over. It's
No,
just
no.
a
Yeah, I'm not stapling things to things and not like.
Oh gosh,
putting them
yeah,
on
that's
the
true.
part-time secretary's desk,
Yeah.
like the file or whatever.
File it, but you
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
Yeah, I generally use.
If you're gonna like spend that much, like I would like for you
And
actually
it
not to
doesn't
just
have a
burn my hair.
buy it
That
on
way,
Kindle.
we might.
But you can get this book by anymore.
If anybody was wondering, the Rangers beat the Rays.
Yeah, so you
So
buy
they're
it.
first.
No, they were not. They were not. They were the longest.
Yeah, the Astros, I mean, give them credit, they won 4 games in a row to win the division.
Online,
Yeah,
but it's just like you
uh,
have it for
switch
7
sides,
days
right?
or something.
Yeah.
You know?
That's hard.
Whoa.
Yeah, he got.
Yeah.
That actually happened?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It happened. Man,
When McCarthy got booted,
right.
he's no longer the speaker of the house.
Oh, yeah.
You're mostly digital copies.
It's okay.
Yeah,
There you go.
I
Hey, last thing about the Rangers losing the division,
some audio
like they
books or
sold
something,
Yeah.
but lately.
Oh, silver lining.
The 6 books, but this.
Wait, did you guys?
Oh, I can't find it on Scribe.
Comedy got.
So,
Yeah.
So
Now,
you see,
and then,
I get about
Scherzer's
80% hit rate. And so
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm gonna follow mine is on Kindle.
Yeah, the Mets,
Or just go to the library.
Yeah.
career, yeah. They're both.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like,
That, if you had both of them, there'd be like no question.
You can do it, right?
Yeah.
I don't even know how to.
Yeah.
Right.
Do you feel like you're going into the postseason pretty?
Like when I go to my father and I'm like, hey, can I do this? He's like, yeah, go do it. Yeah. He doesn't like my. It's just if he does, he goes, you can more money. And I'm just like, okay. I'm working.
You had that even there? Awesome.
Yeah, it's like,
Yeah.
Like we've had problems.
yeah, it's probably not good. I don't know if that's necessarily healthy, but it probably would be good. I have asked for some specific things, like when we do specific events or trips, and I know I'll go, hey, like, what did that look like? Or what was, do I need to adjust what my trip, like what I'm like asking for payment or like things like that, but yeah.
I know, so like the book would be about the delivery. And so like suddenly.
Right, yeah.
Or just the what have you found to be the most basic things, right? In Rangers, I now want to
Yeah. But it like, I feel like makes such a difference because I've had a friend who worked at a church and then worked at a church. Like, wow, I didn't realize.
Okay.
My
There is someone in Wichita
faith
that is at a church.
right? I've never had to think about like what a business can I do? Like how much can I do? You know, like I've never had to think about that. And so I feel like that does
How to engage.
does make
online.
a difference, especially if you're
Actually, the
not.
guy who started it, so he's
I was right.
yeah.
Oh my gosh, it's a big chair. So.
Meta ministry.
But
when you're
no,
actually,
okay, you
like,
need to have your G number. Your G.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you don't need to
You just need that. You just need that number. Because I think that is like your.
And he actually got a hold of me.
Naturally. I need to find.
Because
we're an email to us, right?
On some.
And on how to register that first time.
It was out of his position, right? It wasn't out of his.
And I didn't realize it was and I actually, my professor was having to go to other schools because they're not just like, well, now it's to other parties.
Nice student.
Yeah, that's been
There's
going for
a,
years.
like 2 years ago, I went on a report and then we talked to her and she told me all about it. And you know this guy? And we're like, yeah. In my hometown, but like,
I know Charles Taylor from the Republican
It is. You're just for me.
I know people have.
So you're off.
That's one of her.
It's like
I've heard, but I think you could also find it in my info on
For Mennonite,
Like church partnership was always kind of set up.
so I don't know, I know like.
You might be in the same role too, where it's like.
More people.
Partnership is set up by where we are. Usually for younger.
我唔記得咗你而家喺邊個 stay 話，你而家喺邊個 stay 度 serving stay 嘅 你就喺呢個我講嘅話係咪講翻嘅話 ？OK， 你喺邊度？而家你喺邊個州嗰度先？係咪喺美國？你係咪美國？
你話我服侍就點啊？
係啊係啊，
就喺呢度。我住 Fuller， 我嘅教會係 El Monte， 30分鐘。
咁係咩 status 喺度啊？你係學即係講學者？
唔係，我嚟 Fuller 係學生簽證。係。咁我2年前我 THM 畢業，我就轉咗叫宗教工作簽證。如果唔係我唔可以工作。所以佢都係宗教工作簽證。
咁樣係咪喺度做嘢咧？我有啲朋友都喺度做嘢噶嘛。咁佢哋話喺度做嘢咧，唔代表可以留喺度住嘅喎，要抽籤啊。
有啲唔同。嗰啲係叫 H1 工作簽證，咁我呢種係叫宗教工作簽證，咁有少少我呢種咧就係 R1 你做滿2年，再申請綠卡。咁佢嗰啲 H1B 咧，其實而家比較難要抽籤，你要抽到先至可以走嗰個申請綠卡嘅。即係走唔2個工作。
即係起碼唔使。
Okay, there it is.
相對會容易少少。
I know, I had to go find my acceptance letter.
呢度嘅教會係都係華國嘅教會。
喺我而家服侍嘅教會係印度、台灣教會，但係我哋有台語、即係我有4種語言。但我哋最初係台灣嘅教會。
咁你幾多個幾多個牧師啊？
有4個。我都係算比較早。
Okay. We're going to talk a little bit more, and we're either going to take a break or Hunter will come and we'll we'll let them take it from there. But I just want to turn this one more way, and this ties in a little bit of some things that Dwight said today. But I think this is something that could really help me in my doctoral studies. My PhD is in education. I really resonate with what Dwight said about trying to find the space for youth ministry where I didn't really necessarily, I wanted to do research. I wanted to get a degree that really thought about methods. I also cared deeply about the transcendent and about spirituality, and I was trying to find a place to do that. My degree is at a land grant institution, Michigan State. So, I mean, spirituality and like land grant institutions don't necessarily line up. But the funny thing is they actually do, because great learner-centered teaching actually attends to the learner, right? And we know that college students, when they go to college, about 80% of them would say that like they have some sort of theistic outlook on the world, which is interesting. I mean, is it transcendent? I don't really know. It certainly is this belief that there's something beyond themselves, whether that's postmodern or otherwise. But for teaching and learning, this is really, really crucial, because if college students are actually like thinking that there's something beyond just the temporal in some way, shape, or form, like teaching to that is really, really important about the way people make meaning, right? The problem I was running into at my institution is you have sort of these competing sort of worldviews as to how we know things. Okay, one is the side. Oh, it's not up here yet. One is the side of what would be like positivism or essentialism, right? This is this idea that, and I'll explain it in a second, it's a way of looking at the world where we kind of know what's out there and what the truth is, and we just got to believe it or not, right? The other side is this side of constructivism where there is nothing out there and basically our realities are constructed. The only reason we know truth is simply because it's socially constructed, okay? Most universities in like land-grant institution, public universities hold to more of a constructivist view of the world. Now, as a Christian, I really wrestled with this because I didn't really know what to do with that. Like, I believe in, I'll show you why in a second, why obviously there's this ultimate reality of which we're living toward and everything else, yet this constructivist view is actually kind of real as well, and I was really torn for a while. And then as I did some more reading through some remarkable people, and then discovered that people like Christian Smith at Notre Dame, and T. Wright as a theologian, and a few others, I realized that there's actually a third way. And I think this really unlocks some things for me, and I want to share it with you because maybe it'll help you as well. Okay, so when we think about this idea of how we know things, positivism has two categories. We have ontology and we have epistemology. Okay, so ontology is just like kind of like where we came from, like, you know, or like this idea of reality. Okay, it's sort of this deep embedded element of who we are, where epistemology is how we know things, right? It's kind of this idea of how we make sense of the world and all that comes with that. And positivism says, look, there's just one reality out there, okay? There's one God, there's a story, like the world works in a particular way, and that's particularly out there. And epistemologically, a positivist will say, look, we can know what that reality looks like objectively. There's an objective world and it's knowable and we can figure it out, okay? Now, you might imagine that for some that that's a little scary, right? It can feel oppressive. For a constructivist, they would say that the person in power is defining who reality is, so that if you superimpose a truth on me, you're actually you are oppressing me because you are the one in power, and therefore I'm making you believe what I tell you to believe, right? And especially marginalized communities are often quite suspicious of positivism because they're usually the ones that have been hurt in these sort of situations, right? The other side of the coin is this idea of constructivism. So ontologically, when we think about like reality, constructivists would say there are multiple worlds. There's not just one. There's lots of ways for us to do that, and we know that simply because epistemologically realities are constructed, and what one known is just subjective. So there is no objectivity. There is only subjectivity. You have your perspective. I have my perspective. And they don't necessarily overlap, and there's lots of ways to look at the world, okay? And this works in some ways, but there's some limitations to this, and I think one of the biggest limitations for me is I just don't know how we talk to each other if there are just multiple realities and we all just have our opinions, right? And I think in a very basic sense, especially with young people, it can be like this idea of, well, you know, you believe what you believe, I believe what I believe, and we all live our happy lives, right? So hey, you're too early.
I know, I'm just.
I'm giving you a hard time, Cutter. So we run into a problem with that, where all we have is perspective and everything is socially constructed. So there really isn't a sense of truth, or there isn't the sense of any sort of transcendence in some sort of way. What happened is there is this sort of I don't know if I'd call it a middle ground or I'd call it a third way. We hold this idea of what they call critical realism. And critical realism holds to this idea that the critical realist is a positivist in its ontology and constructivist in its epistemology. Okay, so they would say, and a critical realist would say there is one reality, but we see this reality subjectively and depend upon good research and dialogue to understand it, okay? So people like Christian Smith, other people that probably hold to a sense of religion or spirituality, or think about this idea of the ultimate reality, we would hold to this idea that there is this one reality, but we can't see it objectively. we can't, simply because we're human beings. We are limited in our understanding. We are limited in our perspective. We are limited in our experiences. For us to make massive comments about the way the world works, given our limited capabilities, would be arrogant and ignorant. Okay, so that doesn't necessarily work. But it doesn't mean that we can't say anything about reality. It just means that we can't see it completely. And so the need then, epistemologically, is to engage others in dialogue in order for us to understand the ultimate reality better. Okay, so here's where community becomes so important. I can't figure it out on my own. I actually need all of you and your stories and your perspectives to check me on my assumptions, to correct my perceptions, and to help me see a world more clearly. And when we do this together, we are working toward the goal of, hopefully a better understanding of the way the world works. Now, Christian Smith would say this is really crucial in research, right? We're always interrogating each other, pushing each other on each other's assumptions and research, not because we're trying to compete with each other, but together, hopefully we can come up with a better view of the way the world works. And so what we can do then is we can celebrate research and the sciences and everything else as tools that we use to better understand people in the world and how that works. And that helps us with our theology and everything else, okay? The thing I like about this as well, and Miroslav both talks about this, I don't know if it was any of the books that we read or not, but especially in, I think his book on reconciliation, when we recognize the fact, and I think this is really important for those that sometimes hold to positivism, I think if you're a positivist, you're like, I have the truth, and I'm going to convince you that I have the truth, and I'm also going to protect the truth from you tarnishing it. See the problem with that? And I think there are some institutions or people in position of power that will hold to that. What happens then is that if we disagree and I hold to a positive expression, then you and I are enemies, right? I'm protecting, and I don't want you to tarnish what I do. If I'm a constructivist, we can both hold things and we just don't really have a conversation. It's just, we kind of live in our worlds and do our own sort of things. A critical realist says, we're not enemies. Kate, I keep looking at you. Yeah, I know. We're not enemies, but we're friends, right? The truth is something that I don't hold or you don't hold and we fight for. It's actually, the truth is something that we're seeking to understand, and we're friends and we're walking side by side toward a better, clear understanding, okay? So the work that we do here is more than just you getting your project done and getting your degree, which I hope that you do, but as you contribute to the youth ministry conversation, you're contributing to hopefully seeing and understanding youth more clearly so that we can serve them better and we can speak to them where they need the most help and where they're really longing and thinking about ways that we can show them transcendence and all that comes with that, right? So this is sort of the hybrid, right, of the fact that critical realism believes in one reality, but also just epistemologically says that we're working on this together. And for me, I remember it clearly in my doctoral studies, something unlocked for me. Maybe it was just like, I felt like I didn't know where I fit in sort of the academic world with regards to positivism and constructivism. I really didn't feel like I was either. And that was a weird place. And then I was like, I don't know what to do with that. And critical realism sort of opened up the space for me to understand the point of dialogue, to understand the necessity of research, to understand the importance of theology, and also to understand the importance of community in the ways that we work together. It frees us too to also be able to say, and some traditions are better than this than others, to be able to say, as we talk about God and we try to understand the way God works, to be able to say, yeah, I might be wrong. Like I might be wrong about this. I'm not sure if I fully have a complete answer for this, but this is my best faithful step in my understanding of the way things work right now, right? And so I think there's something about this for me that perpetuates a sense of grace that we can give toward one another, that we're all in process and trying to understand, and there's room for us to continue to grow and to continue to question our assumptions and grow. For me as a writer, this is completely liberating because, like, you know, writing a paper is like, I mean, it's a big deal, and sharing it with each other is a big deal. But like when you publish something, you sort of ask that question, am I going to believe this in a couple of years? Am I going to be embarrassed what I wrote? You know, You probably have had an old sermon, like I don't know about you, I've gone back and apologized to some of my youth group kids, like
For
I'm
sure.
really sorry. I was at a weird kick, I read this book and I did I'm really sorry.
Yeah.
I don't believe that anymore. I hope it didn't mess you up too much, right? Like, but I think if we're in the pursuit of truth and that's our posture, then I think that we can extend grace to each other to say, like, we're all in process and we're doing the best we can to be faithful to what we know and what we have now, and then we have each other to continue to guide us with that along the way. And I think when that happens, I think that is really really exciting. And that's my hope for all of you. I think Jamie Smith, I might have you read this book down the road, but he has a book called How to Inhabit Time. And he talks about, I think I was telling Will and Mavis about this, that he talks about this idea of arrival truth and process truth. And a lot of times we think that we have to have arrival truth, know it all, give the right answer, not make any mistakes. Process truth is to own the fact that we are in the pursuit of truth and there's a process associated with that. And sometimes we're not ready for the truth yet, the complete essence of it, but we are getting bits and pieces along the way. And we're actually developing and growing along the way. It's like a butterfly, right? Like we have to actually go through the struggle to arrive at the truth, because then there's meaning rather than just getting the truth right away, right? We all want the truth right away, but then we miss the process along the way. And it's the process truth that actually forms us, right? That's good news, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's such good news, right? And so critical realism, I think, gives us the opportunity to do that, where we have the opportunity to really work hard at what we're doing and trying hard to interrogate our beliefs and move us in the direction of trying to see reality more clearly. Because when we see things more clearly, hopefully we can advocate for people better. And so as you do your work, you're going to find and read things that are going to conflict with each other, and you don't have to necessarily decide. But I think that's the process where we kind of say, how are these two voices helping me see the issue clearer as I try to understand things more? And so I just wanted to share that with you. If you want more info on this, I can point you to some chapters to read or that type of thing. But for me, it just kind of set me free. So I just share that with you because I think it could be really, really helpful. And I think it helps us get to some of the deeper questions that we're talking about, right? Like, what is church is not, I mean, we don't need a arrival truth answer for that, but we need a good process truth, right? We're interrogating what truth and youth ministry is about, because we want to see it more clearly and we want it to be better, right? And so the past isn't bad, right? The past is just the past. It just doesn't necessarily serve in the beginning because we have to recalibrate, right? That's the process that we're moving toward along the way. So, yeah, go ahead.
What do we do when those that process truth, I get overwhelmed by it because I have so many coming and they come in these circles, so I feel like it's liberating to hear and it's hopeful and it's normal, but how do you keep from feeling overwhelmed when that's all coming at you continuously? How do you quiet it all to teach without just feeling like you're in the middle of it all? Okay. And that's kind of how.
Yeah. Well, you just do a DMIN program. No, I would just say, I think I would be gentle. I think if you and I were sitting down in a room together, just over coffee or something, I think I would just say, first of all, be gentle with yourself. I don't think the impulse is for you to know it all. I think it's for you to become. And I think you have to decide which things are most important to you that you're going to explore first. And then you can go to the next thing. I think that sometimes, at least when I started research too, I'll give you a picture of my brain. It was like data points were like this. And I was like, oh, what am I supposed to do with all this, right? And then over time, what began to happen is all of a sudden, things began to connect. And what happened was, I wish I could make this turn into a beautiful picture, but the point was it became more manageable because all of a sudden I was able to see the relatability of certain things. I began to understand the conversations of certain things, and I began to have an opinion about it. But that just kind of comes with this patient I'm reading this, and I think, let me just say this to you all. This is really important, and this is different than master's and undergrad study. You can't study in a panic. I'm really serious about this. Like, you don't cram your doctoral work. It's like this mulling over. It's this marinating of you thinking and coming back to things. And I think what happens is your mind begins to find places for these disparate things that seem disparate that begin to come together. But it only comes with time. I don't like, that's the only way. You have to just kind of sit with it, right?
Yeah.
And then I think things turn into second nature. But that doesn't come right away for a lot of reasons. Namely, sometimes in some of the things that you're introduced to, it's all new to you. And even the books that you read make assumptions about what you know. Right? Have you ever done that? Like someone's like, you're reading something and like, oh man, I got to read the book that this person referred to because I don't know what they're talking about, right? So there's a lot of like almost getting your intellectual bearings on the things that seem confusing to you before you can even begin to like solve it. And the good news is this, is that that's okay. Like that's, like, we don't panic study, we just let it. It's a discipline, right? I mean, it's like, when I tell my students, this is like, studying is formational, like we're becoming, right? It's not just about knowledge, it's like we're becoming different people because we want to hold the way we look at the world differently because we can serve people better for that. There's always a person at the end, right? I mean, this is why I like Dwight so much. Like we're always thinking about where it's going and the people that we're serving, right? But that work that you're doing to just sit is not a waste of time. It's actually for the benefit of people that don't have the luxury to do that marinating, right? And the angst that you feel, that's actually really, really great. So I don't know. I don't really know who said it, but like a friend of mine who studied like the rabbis and things like that. Like when the rabbis would find a contradiction in the Bible, they would celebrate because it speaks to the mystery of God. Right? That doesn't always feel great, but like I think sometimes we equate spirituality with certainty, where I think there's an element of mystery that reminds us that there's more to know, and like we can't domesticate God, right? Like we actually something gets set free, right? Yeah. And this is where we can lean on each other as well. There would be times where it's like, I think I'm going out of my mind. Then just say it. Like that's okay. Like that's like normal. Like, yeah, it's normal. So anyway, I wanted to share that with you as just a little bit. Cutter's going to be back in about 10-ish minutes or so. So I'm just going to give you another break. I mean, it's been we've got a long afternoon. Unless you guys want to talk about something, otherwise we can just take a breather or you can talk amongst
Can I ask a question about our final product?
Yeah.
Never mind.
Yeah.
No.
Yes.
This is, I'm asking him, I wanted to ask about a book, but you go ahead.
I think you should go first.
Okay. Yeah. All I wanted to do is, can you lead us to a book on the history of youth ministry? Do you have any suggestions?
Well, if you just want a historical understanding that's a little bit outdated.
Yeah, well, that's okay.
And it probably does not, I'm
How
almost
can
afraid.
history be outdated?
It kind of, well,
it kind of is.
It is.
Because
It
it's
is.
history.
So nobody's
There's
written anything
a
recent.
professor from Trinity, Mark Center, wrote a book on youth ministry, but it only goes up to about 2000.
Okay.
It's probably pretty white and old.
Is that the one that talks about like World War II parents, like throughout the war and how those have affected the kids and how that's?
I don't know. It's been a while since I've
I know
read it. It's an older book.
God shows up. That's the Mark Center.
Oh yeah, that's right. Mark, God shows up. Yeah.
When God shows up.
Yeah.
I just want a context. I get that it's something just a framing.
For sure. Yeah, I read that.
Oh, historically, yeah, edited by Ken Dean, that Right Start, yeah. I mean,
Right Start.
These are old.
Yes, yeah, you're right. I'm from Princeton. I've read that Right Start. Yeah.
Sounds like somebody needs to write one.
Yeah.
Morgan, your book. Sounds like a great book for older youth.
There's another little book, Youth Ministry 3.0, where Mark Ghostwriter puts like, he has like an opening 2 chapters where he kind of lays out like the 3.0 and 1.0.
Okay,
kind of
that'd be,
history. It's actually a helpful little practical.
Okay,
yeah,
okay.
yes.
Why do I know that name? What else has he written?
He's with Youth Cartel now. He wrote a book during COVID, like, yeah.
That seems so aggressive.
Youth
Cartel? Yeah.
Sounds like there needs to be a new
He
book.
was
Morgan?
Yeah, President of
today.
president
We're always,
of that for a
she
while.
can do it.
So,
I just want, I know it's not that old.
okay, so, final project.
My question is, so I kind of came into this thinking we had to write like a big paper, or maybe even like a book at the end of this, but then I heard like somebody be like, or I think Andy, you said you built like a program for your final project, or. And
That's
so
the
I'm
curriculum in it, yeah.
curriculum, like a curriculum. Is that allowed?
So so you're talking about the final project, like the
Like
Holy
our
Grail.
doctoral project.
The Holy Grail.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's
that's
done.
what Andy did. But, and so we can write.
So there are different options. You can write a straight up dissertation. You can also write something that's more applied, like Andy, like something that's a product. Now you still have to do like the
But it's a
rigorous
small-
work.
well, yeah, I mean, the curriculum was like the last chapter of the book or of the project. So it's like it had 7
So like
chapters.
curriculum with like
Yeah.
including your philosophy behind it and like all
Yeah.
that, like that would be the
Yeah,
paper.
Yeah.
If you,
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, yeah.
You can stay for the next 3 years.
Yeah.
She wasn't sold until this moment.
That sounds way better.
Yeah.
It was a lot of
The
work.
woman that just graduated from this cohort, Fiona, she did it on Anglican girls and virtue.
Yeah.
And then was thinking about curriculum for, she's a teacher at an Anglican school, and, you know, how has curriculum perpetuated or misrepresented females, and what it means to be a good girl in an all-girls school. So, I mean, it is deep. It is like, it's all about virtue, and she pulls in a bunch of philosophy, but then it also has this very practical element. And so she tested this with other educators as well, which is really, really cool.
And
So,
she made
yes.
her paper available to people too.
Oh, she did?
Yeah, she
Okay.
gave like a Google Doc
Oh,
drive
good.
that anybody
Alright,
can
yeah.
have, so.
Is that
Okay.
that's on the Fuller page, right?
Did she might have, maybe, it was either, was it on her personal one?
Okay,
I know
yeah.
it's on some page.
Yeah, it'll eventually get posted in the library, but yeah, so project is, you can do that, or dissertation, and you know, it kind of depends on how you want to use it, how you want to up with that. Some want to develop curriculum, some want to write something out of it. It just really depends, but.
In doing empirical research, like ask a question like, what are youth leaders' perceptions of a theme in a particular church? Is that an option?
Yes, yeah, and we would have to talk about how you use research, like, it could be you talking with some people and we can figure that out. If it's an actual, like you're saying you want to do research proper, then you have to go through the Human Subject Review Board, and that would be me, because I'm on it.
You're saying there's like an option for like, if we did want to do like you interview people and you turn that into like what real, like.
Yeah, we could
How
decide.
would we get trained in that? if that
Yeah,
was-
well, you would. I mean,
That's
there is a
just
method.
like long-term skill.
Yeah, so I think there's, you probably could do that as your elective. You could do a methods course. And I could help you with that as well. And I mean, the process of applying for human subject review and doing that, I think is a great process. It's a great long-term skill, especially as you're thinking about perhaps grants down the road or research that you want to do. I mean, that would be something worthwhile. I mean, I'm a little bit biased toward that because that's something I'm interested in, but yeah.
Okay.
We run a curriculum as part of that dissertation.
Yeah.
Are you making?
Told last year, so forgive me.
Oh.
Does that have to be
Shouldn't do what they did.
tested and then reviewed as part of that dissertation? Or is
Not necessarily. It can be proposed and then you can show how you're gonna test it later.
Okay.
Or you could test it and that can be part of your findings too. It just depends on where you're in the process and what you want to do. But it doesn't have to.
When I did mine, I tested it after I finished.
Yeah.
It was not a part of my.
That's why you
I tested it and here's what my reflections were around that.
Yeah.
And we can use ChatGPT to write most of this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
You can do it. You can use
you
it.
can do it. You won't pass, but you can do it.
We'll see about that, Andy.
Oh, challenge accepted.
Andy and I are gonna have to look extra close at all. That's right. If you all have like the same paragraph, then we're really gonna worry. So,
I have a thing I want to share with y'all that I can't take credit for. I was on YouTube looking for a way for the iPhone to read Kindle books. And some lady, I have no idea who she is or whatever, commented that there is an app called Amazon Alexa. And so on your Kindle app, you tell Alexa, Alexa read Kindle, and they start doing it. And it will read your last Kindle book to you. So what I do is I set that up. I've got, headphones or whatever on, and it's playing in my ear, and I'm reading it on the screen. So when I want to highlight something, I highlight it, and it continues to read. You can also set it to 2, so it reads the book faster, and then you finish your reading, and you're actually taking it in. You can do notes. You can do audio notes, like stick the note into the computer, and it'll write it down. So those of you who love to annotate, you can annotate as well. And then you go back and you can search your notes, have it ready, copy and paste, or research, all of that. So
I think, Brian, you have to have Audible for that though. Like
No, it's different. I asked the same question yesterday. It's different.
But you can do the same exact thing through Audible.
His is taking like the.
Well, but yeah, he's not buying the audio.
Yes, that's
it'll
it.
read, like you buy the Kindle book and it'll read it to you. So like, I love it because I'm getting the auditory, I'm getting the reading, it's all the same.
So great. On Friday, I'm gonna talk a little bit more about how do we collect our data, how do we hold on to resourcing and everything else. That's very, you could talk more about that, but I think that's a great opportunity. But I think we have to think about like, how do you frame your projects? How do you think about things? Not for this year, but then the long term as well. So I hope to try to set you up for that as well. Which should be really important. A successful demon student is an organized demon student. I guarantee it. Yeah.
That wasn't against you, Van.
Oh, Fern. Thanks
My old
for
school
it.
folders.
Earlier about it. Listen, I got that ADHD a little bit, and my friend Morgan, she's got my back. She's like my life.
There we go.
So.
Friend, really? Really, friend?
Hey, yeah. Anything else? What do you got?
She has.
Okay. Does anybody need recommendations for dinner tonight? Are you all?
Hit us with them. It'd be great.
Well, Old Town's the place to go. You can go to One Colorado. There's an Italian restaurant. There's also a restaurant called Sage, which is vegan, but it is delicious. It's one of my favorite places, Sage, and it's really beautiful. It's a really beautiful space. So, especially if you sit out on the deck. So that would be a place to go. There's also in One Colorado a sushi place, and then there's also a place called Santorini, which is like sort of northern Italian food, and it's like upstairs. So like One Colorado, there's a bunch of places right there that you can go to if you're interested. True Food Kitchen is at the end of Colorado. It's good food. That's decent. If you want a fancy Mexican, someone gave you a bunch of money and you want to go to fancy Mexican, Maestro on Union. Highly recommend it. And
What do you mean,
or you can go to Lucky Boy.
Get a massive.
If you want to go on Lake Avenue, there's a place that's up on the roof. It's called the Granville, and they have good food, and it's just a nice atmosphere. You can sit outside, and that's kind of nice as well. So
How do you feel about urban plates?
You've
said enough.
Yeah.
I went there last year.
No, I mean it's fine.
It is not fine. It is not fine.
Not a great recommendation, it's fine.
I do have a couple of other sushi restaurants if you really want sushi tonight. It's a really nice Japanese restaurant right here downtown. Really, I forget the name of it, but I will get it to you. But it's,
How do you feel about sugarfish?
Sugarfish is very, very good. That's right next to
Lemony.
Yeah, lemonade.
Yeah.
And I mean, lemonade is really good food too. It's not like it doesn't feel like a sit down to me, but lemonade's really good. Sugarfish is really good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there
It's
any
just
sushi?
It's
places
sushi.
that, like,
It's just been hyped to me so much.
Like, I love sushi, but vodka with don't like sushi.
Oh,
Like hibachi or like.
look at my face I just made. Sorry, I just really.
No.
I don't know about hibachi. I mean, there's a, no, it's like hot pot on green, but they have like, it's like really authentic. I mean, it's.
Do you like
I know,
it?
I've had her.
It's a lot of meat. I mean, it's like grilled meat. I'm not vegetarian, but,
But you're
In
not
the
a
middle of the
meat guy.
country.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Okay, sorry.
So,
Top
yeah.
5, one more time, run through them.
What's that?
5.
Like eating seafood. and-
One Colorado is like.
And like North
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
square right behind the Nike store. And you've got El Furno, which is
Isn't that where
Italian,
Mount
very,
Rushmore?
very nice. Sage, which
Where?
is vegan.
Is that
This
South
stuff.
There's a sushi restaurant, I forget the name of it, it's right there. Right next to Sage, and then Santorini is Northern Italian, really good, and that's upstairs. Right next to the
Being
sushi
nice to
restaurant, so it's all
Canada.
kind of right there. And then you got Two Foods,
Isn't it next to
Hey, that
Montana?
Amazing.
yeah, really great.
Like that would be big in Michigan. Probably
Yeah, and then a couple
Yeah,
sushi
what's up?
restaurants.
Yeah, hot pot.
Yes.
I eat that all the time.
Who said?
What would Dwight say? He'd be like, that's food.
Yeah, I know, I know,
All the time.
I know, sorry, yeah.
And
It's just as good food.
And
It's good food around here. Yeah.
In terms of
That's.
Man, I was excited because I heard about Fogo de Chao in a rap song and I was like, oh, it's a Fogo de Chao. And I looked it up. It's like $70.
Oh, yeah. Fogo de Chao's like anniversary night. That's when you go on a birthday or anniversary. I don't go there. Yeah, Fogo de Chao is crazy.
It's
It's meat.
It's, I think it's
You
a
are,
Brazilian steak.
Yeah, because
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
If you are a meat connoisseur, that's where you.
It's
go.
like
Yeah.
unlimited.
You can, the vegetarian price is lower.
Yes.
The salad, I'm vegetarian, you use the salad bar, and then there's cheese rolls, and then they bring fried onions and honey.
Yeah, but you can't go to a Brazilian.
But I did like a little.
Yeah. That's a date night. That's like a.
Fish and canned.
I'm sorry, that's where we went. That's where we went for our anniversary. We don't.
She knows, yeah. She's.
It's good though. Fogo de Chao is.
And I love.
What is bubble?
So,
People are like,
I guess I'll explain when he gets here. Is anybody staying on Saturday? You can actually go to the Sphere Makers Conference.
So like, if you're interested.
Oh,
I love
I
it.
feel like, yeah, you got somewhere else. Yeah.
Well, we're gonna, I think we're gonna go hiking. I'll talk
Oh,
to
yeah.
that.
Scratch, yeah, pasta, I'm scratch too.
Or like trail running.
Oh,
So
yeah.
like, I mean, I don't go milk
Yeah,
a
that's
cow
good.
for
I can,
right.
I can, good trail. I can send you into the national forest.
If I had a
What's
cow.
the last time there was a fire at the,
Yep, so a lot of my sauces.
what are the
for
mountains?
a long time.
Oh, the San Gabriel Mountains.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, there was one near, the, yeah, toward the peak up there where the telescope is.
How long have you been working at Fuller?
2015 I started, so this is my 9th year teaching. Yeah.
Were you here in Pasadena before that?
No, I was in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I worked at a church, other Mars Hill, not the Seattle one.
The other part.
So I pastored at that church, and then I taught youth ministry at a small seminary called Grand Rapids Theological Seminary. Yeah, so.
And then you made the hop to Fuller from there.
Yeah, I was already engaged with FYI.